Alright, in this video I'll be replacing the rear springs in my 2012 Nissan Pathfinder. You can see I've already been doing some work out here. With all these rusted bolts on this thing, I usually try and loosen them before I start filming. You can see this thing is broken. This is the new spring I got. It's a Moog. The dealership was asking about $860 for this job, and I am at about $170 Canadian. Now, to remove this bolt, to loosen it up, you can see it's already loosened, I used a breaker bar and a wrench. Everything's 19 millimeter. So I put the wrench on that side. I put the breaker bar on the other. That jack wasn't there when I got it loose, so I didn't have the jack in place. But I inserted the breaker bar with a 3-foot extension, and then I sort of lifted it up and put this 6x6 under it to get a little bit of pressure under there. And then I hit that wrench with a hammer. This bolt was a bit of a bear on there. I used PB Blaster, that didn't work. And you can see I came in sort of on an angle of attack, gave it one smack with the sledgehammer, and it popped loose. The dead blow hammer wasn't doing it. I did PB Blaster for about 2 hours. That did not help anything. I used the torch twice, and that didn't do anything for just trying to move that thing by hand. But like I said, once I took the sledgehammer and gave it one good smack, it went. And I got 2 jack stands down there and a jack in place. And you can see I got a jack under the rear lower control arm as well. And like I said, everything's 19 millimeter. And once you get this thing loose, it's still pretty hard to get off. That bushing that's in there must have shrunk or hardened up a little bit. I should probably get new bushings, but I don't have them in this instance. But when I'm removing this, I do spray a little bit of this white lithium grease in there just to help get that bolt through the bushing. And once it's through it's not too bad, but just getting it through this first time is pretty brutal. And before you start this job, I started without a new bolt and nut for that rear lower control arm, and that's a mistake. I recommend you go and get the bolts for this thing and have them on hand before you start this, especially if your car is rusty like mine. Now, before I pull the spring out, I'm just going to mark the position of the rubber bushings in relation to the control arm. Might not be necessary. What I learned is that there's actually some arrows on those big rubber bushings that go on either end of the spring, so it's not that big of a deal, but having them marked as well helps because it's easier to visualize than how they've done it. So I do get the bolt out and I've got the jack in place so things don't go flying down or up, as the case may be. And it's a little bit difficult to see, I'll show it later, but the bolt's pretty marked up, so it doesn't look good. But I do go and get a new bolt. So once you got that bolt out and things are disconnected, you can lower the control arm. And there is a second bolt in the rear with the adjusting cam on it. I didn't take it out. I didn't really think it was necessary, and everything seems fine without messing around with that. But just so you know, there is one in the back. But again, I had so much trouble getting that first bolt out that one in the rear would be an absolute nightmare, I'm sure, without having this up on a lift and having some additional tools or whatever. But here's the broken piece. You can see it snapped right off there, and obviously it's not good. Of note though, I didn't even realize that this thing was broken. I was just driving around with it like that and didn't even notice a difference. So there they are side by each, and you can tell that the one from Moog has a lot more coils to it. It's a much heavier and more heavy duty coil spring than the one that was OEM to this vehicle. But I'll put those aside. You can see I marked it here, and you can also see there's an arrow. So the arrow points kind of at that circle, but it's a little bit off to the left on this one. When I remove it on the other side, you will see that there are arrows on all the metal components as well. You just can't see it on this one just because of the dirt and corrosion and stuff like that. There's also an indentation up top, and I find that the arrow generally points at that indentation. So anyway, you do want to get the rubber back in the same position. I probably should have got new rubber all around as well. I didn't, but whatever. It'll be fine. It's riding fine. There's no real issues. I do clean it up a little bit, and you could kind of see the arrow in there. It's really faint, but even when I was doing it in the day, I didn't see that arrow. But it just fits in like that, and just having that Sharpie marker on there and the arrow up front, that's all you really need. Pretty easy to do, and honestly, I don't know. They don't sit in there exactly the same because these coils are slightly different. they start and stop sort of at a different point than the original ones for whatever reason, but I'm running them and I don't really notice a problem with them yet. When you put those rubber ends on, they just go in the exact same position as they were before. And some of these are directional and some springs are not directional. So just make sure you know what you've purchased and know which end is up. And there are some resources on that online so that you know which end is which. Now, getting this thing back in was a little difficult. I do a better job on the other side. So if you want to see a little bit cleaner install, you can skip over to the driver's side of this vehicle, but this is a bit more of a struggle. But once it's in, you just got to push the lower control arm down and then it'll pop into place. Now, I put the whole thing together, drove to Nissan, and I got these parts. So get these parts before you start this job. You can see the part numbers on the packaging there, and here's the bolt. It looks like that. And even when I was talking to the parts guy at Nissan, these nuts are odd. You see they got a number 2, like Roman numeral 2 on them, and that is supposed to be a non-reusable nut. So they have some sort of a locking mechanism in there, and you can see the threads change at the end of the nut. So I don't think you're supposed to reuse this. The part guy said you're not supposed to reuse this. If you look at the Haynes manual, some of the ones with that say you're supposed to not reuse them as well. But this one didn't say not to reuse it. So that's why I didn't get these initially. But I changed my mind and I did get the nut and bolt. So highly recommend you get nuts and bolts for this thing if you're going to do this job. Now here's the old one. And one thing to note, you can see where the bushing is. There's a lot of like chips in the old bolt, and you can really see that I did some damage to the nut on this thing getting it out. But just look at how pitted up that is, and that's sort of strange to me because that's actually protected inside of the bushing, but for some reason it really ate the metal up on that bolt. So like I said, I put everything together, went and got the nuts and bolts for this thing, came back, took it all apart again, and this is me doing this one side basically twice. So again, there's the new one and the old one side by side. Recommend getting a new bolt. So once you've got your spring set back in your lower control arm, just use a jack and just keep raising it up until you can feed that bolt through the lower control arm as well as through the bushing, and then obviously out the other side of the control arm. If you wanted to, you could probably bang the bolt right through the bushing. I, on the other hand, just use the socket and just feed it through that way as opposed to doing any sort of damage to the bushing. I'm sure it's already damaged. I'm sure it's in rough shape. Obviously the vehicle's old and obviously it's on its last legs, but we'll try and keep it in good shape here. Give the vehicle a little reach around with the nuts there and tighten that one on the side of the bolt. Now, really I just initially run it down with a regular ratchet with again, a 19 mil wrench on the back side. You can sort of see it there, but I have to switch to a torque wrench to get this down. I would not be able to get it to the right torque with this small ratchet. And the torque spec I have on this is 129 foot-pounds. My torque wrench only goes up by 2s, so I'm using this at 130 foot-pounds. And again, I got the wrench on the back side to hold everything together, and obviously I still have the jack underneath the lower rear control arm. So there it is with the new bolt and the new nut installed. Again, 129 foot-pounds or 130 foot-pounds in this case. And now I can lower the jack down. And just like that, everything is put back together. And I put the tires on. I use 110 foot-pounds for all the lug nuts. Now, this is the one that I had a much better time with. This is the driver's side. So you can see, because I'm pulling down with the breaker bar, I put a jack under there, and that prevents the socket from slipping off the nut. And obviously I got the wrench in there as well, and this one's much better. So the other one was a little more difficult because I have to lift up on it, and this one, because I could get the jack under there as sort of a pivot point, much easier to do. I just used a little bit of PB Blaster, let it sit, and then I went at it with the breaker bar and the extension. And like I said, having either a jack under the small extension for the socket or putting a axle stand under there is my sort of go-to move for these difficult bolts. Anyway, once the bolt is loosened up, I'll get the jack in there, raise the driver's side rear control arm up a little bit and take some of that pressure off the bolt. And just like on the passenger side, I spray a little bit of the white lithium grease in there just to help get the bolt out of the bushing. This side wasn't nearly as bad as the other side, but it was pretty stiff to run the bolt out of the bushing. Overall, I would say the other side was easily twice as hard as this side for whatever reason. This one was just much easier to do. So before I get the bolt out, I do have to raise it up a little bit and then obviously take the bolt out the rest of the way. But once that's done, I could lower the rear lower control arm on the driver's side, and then it'll allow me to pull that spring out of there. And here's the bolt on this side. You can see it's pretty chewed up as well, and that's the area that was under the bushing. So again, highly recommend just getting new bolts and nuts before you even start this job and just have them on hand. It'll definitely be a good move. For this, I just put a little bit of weight on the rear lower control arm with my foot and pulled the spring out at the top, and it came out no problem. And like I said, there is the arrow that's actually stamped on the metal, and you can see there's also an arrow down below that's stamped in the metal. So there are arrows in the rubber and there's arrows in the metal. Line them up. Pretty easy to do. Problem is you can't really see the arrows once you have the spring in there, and obviously that rubber is going to cover the arrow. So I still think using the marker and putting a little bit of a mark on the rubber and the metal is a better call than trying to find those arrows. And here are the springs are side by side, standing up. You can see they're the same height, but just like the other ones, they don't start and stop in the same spot. Like if you look at the top and the bottom, so it's difficult to line those rubbers up properly anyway with these Moog springs, even though they're supposed to be for the same vehicle. I'm not sure if that's a problem with all springs or what, but anyway, I run the springs. Like I said, I have no problem with them. They don't seem to be weird in any way, but just a few things that I've noticed with these, and that's the big one, is that the sort of the ends of the springs are not in the same position as the old ones. Anyway, put the rubbers on the top and bottom of this thing, and again, I do the push down like a gas pedal on the rear lower control arm until I could slide the spring in and then just pop it into place. It's pretty easy, and these springs are not necessarily longer, but they're definitely stiffer, and they've increased the ride height, which I'll show at the end of this. I would say it's added about half an inch to the ride height. I was probably at about 6.5, and now I'm at about 7.25 or something like that. If the rear lower control arm isn't moving exactly where you want it, I just use a bar to push it either left or right, and then just jack it back into position again until the hole in the rear lower control arm lines up with the bushings on the vehicle. Obviously, to do this job, having two of these jacks is very helpful. There is a scissor jack in the back of the vehicle, but that would probably not work as well. I'm not even sure you can get it under the rear lower control arm. Anyway, feed the new bolt in, take the 19mm ratchet and just run the bolt all the way through. Put the nut on the back side, get a wrench on one side of this thing and then a torque wrench on the other side. And again, 130 foot-pounds. And this one's a little bit tougher to tighten because you've got to hold the wrench on the back side with one hand. And turns out 130 foot-pounds is actually quite a bit of force you got to put on this thing. But once it's done, and that's all there is to it. Just get that bolt tight. And once the bolt's tight, same as the other side, just take the jack and you can get it out of there. And there it is. Once again, you can see the bolt and nut in position. So I throw the tire back on, tighten up the nuts, and then I go to a car wash because it's nice and flat and it's well lit. Obviously it's getting late, so you can see I'm somewhere in between 7.25 and 7.5, and obviously I'm just picking up a mark on the side of the tire there, so that's not top of the tire. Just because the tires are recessed in a little bit, it was tough to measure straight, but if I go on the side of the tire on this side, you can see right about the same, right in between 7.25, 7.5. And if I go to the front, it's going to be a lot less. And I would say the rear was lower than the front before by just a little bit. So now the front is actually between 6 and 6.25. So it's almost a full inch lower in the front, sort of comparatively lower. So I'm going to do something about that. I'll work on the front, but the back used to be lower than the front. Now the back is a little bit higher than the front. So I'm happy with that. Overall, brutal job to get the passenger side nut off. Driver's side was no big deal, but the passenger side was a nightmare. I recommend you get the bolts and nuts before you start this job. And if you're going with these Moog springs, they will likely raise your stock ride height by about 1/2 inch. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.